and available on the association's YouTube channel after the conference. We'll be monitoring the chat, so please feel free to post questions or comments there, and we'll do our best to address them. If the speakers are unable to address your comments or questions during their talk because of time constraints, we'll do our best to capture them and follow up individually. And lastly, I just quickly want to say that, you know, climate impacts and our response to them are indisputably the most pressing issue we face as a species across the planet. And as Mita DeWitt so beautifully shared this morning, we would do well to seek leadership, guidance, and expertise from Indigenous people and their stewardship of this planet since time immemorial. And so I'd like to welcome Patrick Saltonstall of the Alutiiq Museum to kick us off today. Patrick, you can share your screen now.
Okay. That's good. Am I looking right here? Okay. So I'm looking at the right screen. Okay, this is the first time I've done one of these.
You guys can see his presentation, right?
Yes, looks great.
Okay, good. I'll go. Basically, I'll give my talk in one slide to begin with here. And I'll read the first part. Last May, with the National Park Service Tribal Preservation Grant to Quinhagak, Inc., the Alutiiq Museum surveyed Sitkinak Island and found that some of the sites are massively eroding. However, not all the sites are eroding, and the survey highlights how on Kodiak Archipelago, erosion varies in time and space according to the region. It's not driven by just climate change and a rising sea level, but also the tectonic setting, long-term land level changes, bedrock type, geographic setting. And my main point is that for these reasons, erosion is also differentially affecting the archaeological record. Some sites and not others are getting destroyed. And this is creating false patterns that we need to be aware of when doing regional analyses. Not all of the sites are there. And it is also important to note that this is not the first time Kodiak has had to deal with a period of severe erosion. Episodes of severe erosion have occurred frequently in the past and have always differentially affected the archaeological record. There's something you always have to be aware of. And I hope to sort of show you that in this slideshow. But first I'll start with Sitkinak. And here's Sitkinak down at the south end. It's a very exposed place. This is Kodiak. And actually, this is the view from Russian Harbor. And we surveyed all this area in the last couple of years as well. And so this is from Russian Harbor looking south over Archaeological, and there's Sitkinak. It has like 1,500 foot mountains. It's 8 by 20 miles. It's a pretty big island. And Sitkinak is very little archaeological research. Herlichka went by here. He heard about sites out there. Don Clark heard about sites, but only there've been 2 little Section 106 jobs out there in the 80s and 90s, but no new sites have been reported. So basically it's unknown. So here's the island. You can sort of see 20 by 8 miles. And we did a helicopter all along the south shore pretty much. Oh, I do. we did the helicopter survey of, you know, a lot of it. And then we got dropped off here and we hiked all the way here along the coastline, maybe like 45 miles or so. And all these little red numbers are the site names. I took the dots off to keep it, the site locations kind of secret. And as we went, we'd try to keep a running tally between glass balls and archaeological sites. And it wasn't until here that the archaeological sites overtook the glass balls. But it's worth noting also that we'd heard about a huge site here from Jim Tungate, an old miner. He showed me about a site here that was 20 feet thick, acres in size, gone. Another one here that was reported to Don, didn't even exist anymore. It was just beach peats. And then another one here that our helicopter pilot Keller had been telling us about, and was one of the reasons we went out, only half a house bit left. And then here's another big site that was totally gone. These big villages were gone. This just to show you about how much erosion is occurring in certain places out there. This is the screenshots from my Gaia on my iPad. And you can sort of see this is our helicopter route right along the top of the high tide line. And it's on a satellite photo from like last 5 years. And this is the same on top of USGS made in the 50s. You can see like a quarter mile. And it's not just because the image has been offset. You can sort of see the same lakes here and here. So a quarter mile of the coastline is gone. And probably there was a site here because it's a nice anadromous stream, beautiful place for a site. but quarter mile of erosion, nothing there. But it's also worth noting that here it was ocean in the 50s, and now there's land building. So some places the coastline is getting bigger. Here's some of the severe erosion. This is the site that the helicopter pilot has wanted us. He's one of our site stewards. He looks at sites for us. He's wanted me to come out here for years to check out the site. It was like whalebone everywhere, lamps, pottery, all just eroding out on the beach. We got there last year. Half of one house pit is left. That's all that remains of this once massive village. You can sort of see there's the hearth for the fireplace. This is another one that Don was reported to Don Clark. Don Clark never went there, but he'd heard about this big village here at the south entrance to the Sitkinak Lagoon. And you can see this is all just back, the stuff that would have been in a swamp behind the site. The site was probably out here and it's gone. Okay, now the good news. Here's like this, where this right here in the salmon berries and right here, this big house pit. This is a Kachemak era village, long way from the coast now. Totally stable, totally fine. Here's a Kodiak village on the lagoon. You see this big house pit here, stable, not eroding, totally fine. So that's sort of what's happening in Sitkinak. Now, the gist of my talk is sort of like looking at Kodiak as a whole and sort of fitting in how Sitkinak fits in with that. And all these red little lines, sort of Patrick's redneck GIS, these are surveys the Alutiiq Museum has done in the last 25 years. So these are all the areas we surveyed, and we've systematically record a bunch of data for each of those sites. So I'll sort of show you that on the next one. We record how many house pits, era, it's done very systematically. We haven't gone everywhere, but we also have site stewards through the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service funded the program. And they tell us about sites that maybe not in this area. Like we get a lot of data, other areas, we find out information on the sites. And we also have the sites that Don Clark and Workman took photos of, and they recorded a lot of it too back in the 60s and 70s. Don Clark actually wrote quite a nice thing on Kodiak erosion in his 1974 B volume about contributions to Kodiak archaeology. So we have a data set that goes back over 50 years. And for some sites, we have pictures that Herlichka took, like of the Gizi Islands, where you could sort of see how big sites were in the 30s. So we really have a long data set. And we have like over 900 sites that we've been looking at in the last 25 years. So this is sort of how, when I go on a survey, I categorize. This is a page from our report when we surveyed Zacher and Spiriton Bays a couple of years ago. And we try to be very consistent on how we record all this. Like we have erosion, animal damage, vandalism, modern use. We also have vegetation, house pit types, all that. But this is the one that sort of shows eroding. See, minor erosion is just dirt showing, basically. Minor erosion, you get little bits and pieces breaking off, but it doesn't affect the integrity of the site. Moderate, it's starting to, big pieces are breaking off, but the site's not really threatened. And then here's severe, where you sort of, these are all pits being exposed and big chunks are breaking off. And for this, what my comparison for this AAA talk, I actually made a new one, sort of E5, and it only applies to sites that are large village sites, not like little minor procurement sites or anything. And over half the sites disappeared at some point in time. And I thought about that and I made this map. These are all the sites, it's subjective, but these are all the sites that I know of that have lost half of their mass at some point in time. On the north end here, all these ones, these red dots, these are sites that were severely eroding pretty much after 64. Don Clark and Workman took pictures of these sites, or I got other data somehow, found out about them. And these are all these sites that lost half the mass back then, but have now healed. They are no longer eroding. These purple ones are sites that were completely obliterated after 60. They were obliterated by the end of the 1970s. And then these blue are sites that we've lost half of today, recently. And these yellow ones are sites that have been complete, like the 4 I talked about on Sitkinak, that have been completely obliterated in the last 20 years. And you can see here's for Knecht, here's Karluk 1, obliterated. And it's kind of worth noting, look, on the north end, the sites are stable. They're not eroding. There are not very many blue dots on the northwest or northeast side of Kodiak. Down on the south end and on the east side, there's a problem. Now, the reason for the north end so fine is because of the tectonics. It's what happens is Kodiak, here's Kodiak, and the subduction zone, it's going under Kodiak, and it pulls the east coast down, and behind goes up. That's during, that's what all this explains. Actually, these slides are from my 1996, my first AAA talk I ever gave, and these are scans of them, so it's sort of funny. Talking about the same thing. But so when you have an earthquake, this area goes up and Kodiak itself goes down. It's kind of like drops, it snaps off the plate. And then after that, it very quickly rebounds back up and then starts to kind of crank up again. And if you look on this over here, you can sort of see how much the land sank in 1964. Like around Kodiak, it sank 6 feet, up on a Fogneck 4 feet. These are the areas that are rebounding out of the water more quickly, the fastest. In these areas, the actual sea has not kept up with the land. The land is rising faster than the ocean. And that's why on the north end of Kodiak, the sites are not eroding. Just to think about, other thing, I found this from a report on the Sitkinak formation on, an albatross something formation on Sitkinak. And it sort of shows what happens over the really long haul, like millions of years. I mean, Kodiak is an island because of this underplating is pushing it up. So in the middle of the island, you have the land is always going up, whereas in the Shelikof Strait and on the Albatross banks, it's always going down. So these are, Middle Bay is in the middle of the island. If you look at it in terms of this, so that's the reason it goes up. But you also have local faults. You also have things like water after the end of the ice age coming onto the shelf and like pushing Kodiak with forebulge effect. You have a lot of different things going on, and you kind of need to be aware of that. The whole island doesn't go up and down at the same way. Here's some site data from a Fogneck. I just wanted to sort of show you what these sites look like through time. Like here's a Don Clark or a Workman photo from 1964 of a Fogneck 12 in a Fogneck Bay. And he took this right after the earthquake when the site hadn't started to erode yet. See, here's a nice grassy archaeological site. Here's 1971, 5 years later, severely eroding. I put this as half the site is being eroded away. Here's Nuke Fladmark. I just had to put them in there. And then here in 1996, we returned to the site and it's already rebounding out of the water. It's healing, trees are beginning to grow, grass is growing. And then here it is in 2014, completely stable, grass growing in front of what was eroding once eroding. And I actually measured sea level change since the 90s in this bay by looking at petroglyphs. I took photos in the 90s and you can see the barnacles on them in the 90s. And now the barnacle line is a foot lower. So the sea level in this area has dropped a foot in the last 25 years. Here's another one. I have tons of these. I could just show these forever and ever, but I won't. Here's Long Island. Here's right here is right here. You can see the site was just disappearing. Well, I think more than half the site fell into the ocean in 64. Don Clark actually says this site was eroding even before 1964 because the military mined the beach. But now look, all stable, grass growing in front of the erosion scarp. This is typical of all sites on the northwest end of the island. They really stopped eroding about 15 years ago. And they all have like an erosion scarp and then stuff growing in front of them. And it's also important to note, and I think this comes back to Chirikov, what's your substratum? Like some of these sites that Don Clark and Workman visited in the 60s were built on bedrock. I revisited the site. Not much of the site was lost. It was very hard for this site to erode because it's built on rock, so it doesn't get cut back. And for the record, we found petroglyphs over here. Molly will talk about that. That's the petroglyph place. And here, like here's a hearth and a beach. If you have a low energy environment, sites don't erode that badly either. There's sites on Shuyak, I gather, where there's sites in the intertidal zone. And I saw that on Monday down in the southeast. I thought that was kind of cool. So even with rising sea level, sites can be preserved if there's not a lot of energy hitting them. So now I'll talk about a different sort of long-term erosion that's been happening in Kodiak. This is Woman's Bay. We've been doing a lot of work, and all these red and blue dots are Ocean Bay and early Kachemak sites. And if you looked at this and didn't know any better, you'd say, wow, the population was like way high back then, and they love that inner bay environment, you know. But it's an artifact of erosion, actually. Basically, I think for a long time, up till about 2,000, 3,000 years ago, I got this talking with Gary Carver, the relative sea level in Kodiak was staying the same or dropping slightly, and the beaches were building out. And then for the last 2,000 years, sea level has been outpacing the land changes. The land's been slightly rising, but the ocean's been rising slightly faster. And this is creating a gap as well. And this has been happening repeatedly in time. And I should mention also that those subsidence earthquakes happen about every 400 years. So when you look at a long-term sort of transgression of the ocean, you're gonna have this like tectonic heartbeat on it. Every 300 years, you have one of these earthquakes that creates an episode. But then it's just like a sort of a, Gary Carver would put it's like an EKG on the heart monitor. It's like on the curve. And I'm going to talk a little bit about a site out here at Zamka Mound. You can see all 4 time zones are represented. And here's the site. That's the ocean. And we dug here the first few years. It's an Ocean Bay early catchback site. And right with that picture you're seeing on the left is right here in front of the terrace. And we found the beach down there. This is a thing that shows the beach. The beach 4,000 years ago was back here. And people were living on the site. And then for the next 2,000 years, the beach migrated that way. And you have early, also Kachmak and historic and late prehistoric houses built out there. And then it's been getting cut back now. It's coming back this way. And initially when we dug this site, I thought, oh, the sea level must have been way lower in Ocean Bay times. And that's why it was back here. But then we actually measured this spot, the top of the storm berm right there. And we also measured the top of the modern storm berm. And the sea level is exactly the same, which is kind of surprising. Here's another place where we've had episodic erosion in the past. This is Kiliuda Bay. We did an excavation here. And this is the BIA's drawing of the site. You can see there's house pits. This is what you're seeing now right over here. It's been cut back. And this test pit that you see me standing in is right about here. It's not a test pit, it's a test. And we found, down in here, we found 2 old erosion scars. So this site, this isn't the first time that this site has been lost to erosion. It's happened 3 times before this. It was sort of like eye-opening that this erodes, builds back out, people build out there, erodes, builds back out. It's been happening repeatedly through time. 2 minutes to the end? Oh no. Well, I'm not gonna be able to, I have to go quickly. This is another place out in Quinhagak. All these sand layers represent stable. When you have erosion, you have when the site's, this is eroding, sand isn't blown. So it's happened here. So I'm just gonna go on to the south coast. So what's happening down here? Why are these sites eroding so badly? This is a site right here. It looks like it's gonna get completely destroyed by erosion. And you can sort of see the erosions occurring down here and a few on the outer coast. These ones on Karluk Lake or in Karluk itself are due to fluvial erosion. But I think this might be sea level in storms. But it's worth noting on the south end, these are other sites not eroding at all. Big areas, here's Russian Harbor. All these sites are totally stable and not threatened. And if you were to just look at these sites, you'd think, wow, people were just, they're most of the salmon sites in the inner bay. So it's not surprising that all the older sites we find are in the inner bay. It doesn't mean people are using that area more. It just means those are the sites that we find. We'll go back to Sitkinak. I personally think one reason Sitkinak's eroding so badly is because the bedrock there is terrible. It's a conglomerate. It's like the Sitkinak formation. Here's a site that's about to break off. I didn't even dare check this. So it was 50 feet down to the cliff. And there was artifacts I could see them, but the whole thing was about to break off. And here's Keller has photos. This is eroded 100 and 200 meters in the last 3 years. But I do think rising sea levels and fiercer storms down here are having an effect. And I've often wondered how this area doesn't go up and down in the earthquakes either. It's on what we call the hinge. So I guess just sort of whip through this. Here we are at there's a big village that's not good on a road. Basically, the north end has rising land levels so that sites aren't disappearing. I think the intense storms are affecting the archaeological record. But I've always wondered, could we find periods of storm in the past that have caused erosion? It would be kind of interesting. That's a good research question. And I have to say, I'm really worried what's going to happen when we get the next subsidence event in like 200 or 300 years, when the sea level is already at a raised level, and then it goes down another 6 feet. That might be something to see. But anyway, just to finish up, I think erosion's always taken place. It's always affected the archaeological record. It's removed some sites and not others. And it's something we should always be aware of and sort of try to quantify so we know what sites are going. As I said, this site is not probably going to disappear, but other sites are. And we kind of got to be aware of that so that it doesn't, so when we do our interpretations, we've got to realize our record is biased. And I think that is it. I'll thank the Park Service. They gave us the tribal preservation grant, and then the state of Alaska they gave us permission to survey their land, and Kodiak.
Thank you, Patrick. Thank you very
How
much.
over was I?
You weren't. I took 2 of your minutes earlier, so you're great. You're in good shape.
I really
I'm sorry
rushed
about
the
that.
end because Molly said I had 2 minutes, so I was like, oh no. But if anyone wants it, I have a copy that this is a PDF I can give to people too.
Okay, great. Can you all see my screen? Yes?
Yep, looks good.
Okay, good.
Again,
All right. Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity I'm going to just kick it off since we're short on time. We're going to tell you a little bit about this very encouraging effort to save one of the oldest standing Russian Orthodox churches in Alaska, as well as elements of the surrounding site. So I wanted to start off by expressing our humble gratitude to the past and present residents of Karluk. Karluk is the homeland and traditional territory of the Alutiiq-Sugpiaq people who have cared for and stewarded these lands for at least 6,000 years. The people of Karluk have been instrumental in the success of this effort, and it would have been impossible without their guidance and hard work. And as you can imagine, the residents of Karluk have a multi-generational connection to this church, to the cemetery, and to the entire site. And so this connection really must be at the forefront of our minds as work continues here. Various entities have been involved in this project, which is led primarily by ROSIA, the Russian Orthodox Sacred Sites in Alaska nonprofit organization, and the Russian Orthodox Diocese of Sitka in Alaska. We here at NPS, at the National Park Service Alaska Regional Office, have been able to provide some technical support and assistance through our Heritage Assistance Program. These are some of the other entities that have been involved. ROSIA was started in 2002 by then Bishop Nikolai and interested historians, architects, and clergy. The group really realized the wonderful portfolio of historic churches in Alaska and the desperate need to preserve and maintain them. Here, and I will mention real quick that ROSIA has done nearly all of the fundraising for this effort in Karluk. One of ROSIA's donors, who wishes to remain anonymous, is responsible for the nearly $500,000 that it took to move the building, which I'll be talking about today. Here is a map of the Russian Orthodox churches around the state of Alaska. At ROSIA's founding, Karluk was immediately placed on the top 5 list due to its beauty and age, and a strong voice from a founding board member. This map shows the Russian Orthodox churches across the state that have National Historic Landmark status, as well as those that are listed on the National Register. Here are a couple maps for reference showing the location of Karluk on Kodiak Island and a relatively current satellite image of the area. Kodiak Island, as you know, is the second largest island in the United States, second only to the Big Island in Hawaii. The current church building at Karluk was built in 1888. The site also contains associated outlying structures, archaeological remains associated with the 6,000+ year occupation of the area, and the community cemetery. An outstanding resource, if you're interested in learning more about the history and archaeological research of Karluk, is this book, Kiliuda, which I'm probably pronouncing incorrectly, from Karluk, Kodiak Alutiiq History and the Archaeology of the Karluk One Village Site. I highly recommend this resource. Here are some historic photos of the site showing the original native village infrastructure at the mouth of the Karluk River, all of which is now gone. And on the right, a historic photograph of a traditional Alutiiq sod house called a barabara located near the church. And you can see the dog above the door. I love that photo. Another historic photo showing the cannery and spit, which was eventually breached, and all of this is now gone. You can see the church and the hillside here. And here's a photo from the 1980s, taken not long after a significant storm event that occurred in 1978. And this event really marked the beginning of some of the most dramatic environmental changes at the site, prompted prompted the eventual relocation of the village and leading to the threats that the site faces today. Here's some additional photos from the 1980s and 1990s showing the changes at the site. In the early 2000s, the Karluk Tribal Council reached out to the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers for help. The Corps came to the site to complete an assessment of the bluff erosion and issued a report in 2007. In the report, the Corps explored erosion control measures compared to a move option. And ultimately, they found that a full site move would be less expensive than erosion mitigation at this location. In 2015, the threats to the site became even more severe and the awareness heightened further, prompting a site visit by Rosia and a number of others to formulate a strategy for the potential relocation and restoration of the main building. Grant Crosby of our office and John Wachtel, also of our office, can answer more detailed questions about these figures, but since 2015, a great deal of really technical preservation work and planning has occurred at the site. On the left is an image of a high definition laser scan showing a section through the church, and on the right is a HABS drawing that was derived from this point cloud data. And here's a figure that was initially developed by Sean Mack, our colleague at BIA, showing bluff erosion over time at the site. In March of 2020, right at the start of the pandemic, Grant in our office received some really alarming images from Karluk. This is an aerial image from a site visit that was conducted there in May of 2020. And this is an aerial image that was taken in August of 2021 at the start of this temporary relocation effort. So you can see just between those two images, the dramatic change in one season, basically. Before and after the move, the team was able to have a ground penetrating radar survey completed across much of the site in order to identify possible burial locations and other subsurface features that may be present. Please stick around for Esther Babcock's presentation coming up next to hear more about her work. Here's some images from when we arrived in August of 2021. And it's important to mention that Karluk is only accessible by air or water. Getting personnel, materials, supplies, and heavy equipment there is no small task. The movers and equipment traveled by road from a warehouse in Wasilla to Homer, Alaska. Once in Homer, they loaded everything onto a barge headed for Kodiak. And in Kodiak, everything was unloaded and reloaded onto another barge destined for Karluk. So this transport alone took well over a week. And landing a barge in Karluk, as many of you know, requires agreeable weather and 9-foot or greater tides. If the tides are not high enough, the barge could be grounded offshore. So the barge's arrival had to be carefully coordinated. Some members of the on-site team traveled with the equipment on the barge, and others of us flew in on small aircraft from Kodiak, which, as you know, also requires agreeable weather conditions. Everything just had to be just right. The COVID-19 pandemic obviously made this all the more complex. We were extremely cautious that no outsiders would introduce the virus to the Karluk community. And all of us that were on site followed strict testing, masking, and social distancing protocols during travel and while on site. A couple other photos here. So prepping the site involved placing cribbing beneath the building, jacking it up, and sliding it slowly along the gigantic steel beams that were placed using rollers. So this is a little snippet of the crew just getting started placing these beams. And as you can see, we had some weather. We had some glorious days and some very wet days. This is a quick snippet of the first pull I wish I could share more video with you all today, but just so you know, we have tons of time lapse and real-time video of this effort if anyone wishes to see more. It's really pretty outstanding to watch, but you'll be able to see the building move here in just 1 second. These are some progress shots. Oops, I think I skipped a slide, but that's okay. I was there monitoring the majority of the activity on the site. Some artifacts of relatively recent origin were observed in disturbed contexts, but I observed no disturbance to significant archaeological deposits or features on the site. Thankfully, nor was there any disturbance to any marked or unmarked grave sites. The entire church property is surrounded by the community cemetery. And this is just these are just some photographs of some of the artifacts. And also associated artifacts from the building that had detached and been kind of set in the shed or off to the side or underneath the building. So the building was pulled south and then east and then south again in sort of a zigzag motion. And it ended up about 80 feet inland from its original footprint. It was then set down. It was then set down and secured for now. And when a permanent home is identified, it'll be more or less prepared for this next move. It's wash and wear at this point. It's ready to go. So this is just the team kind of discussing with some key community members and working group members, you know, is this the right place? We're going to set it down. Do we need to move it anymore? That sort of thing. So lots of communication and conversation on site while this was happening. And these final shots taken by Dustin Reft, who lives in Karluk, really show the severity of the situation. As you can see, the original footprint and the slumping of the bluff edge. This is the original footprint. You can see it. It's marked by drier soils. And even these images are better. I particularly like this one in the upper right-hand corner, where you can see the footprint of the building and this slumping edge. Really gives a sense for what we were up against. And here's a before and after. It's not easy to tell, but if you use the shed for reference here, this is the shed on site where various articles are stored. You can see the distance that the church traveled following its move. And this is where it's now set down and kind of mothballed until it can be moved to a permanent location. So there's still so much to do. Our first priority is to identify and secure a permanent home for the church and to reinforce the route to get it there. We need to assess the vulnerability of the features and the grave sites that remain at the site and determine the best way to protect them. We will also assess the condition and preservation needs of the iconography and liturgical items that were removed from inside the church. And that's a whole other story of that effort, which the community really undertook the leadership on. Finally, we need to fully restore the church once it arrives at its permanent home. And we will certainly do all of this in continued collaboration with the community and descendants. And just real quick, in addition to the numerous groups mentioned earlier, this project relied heavily on the combined expertise of several members in the Alaska Regional Office of the Park Service. And this project truly has taken the steadfast dedication of so many different individuals and organizations at all levels, from private individuals, nonprofit organizations, state and federal government. So it's really been a multidisciplinary and multi-organizational effort. And that's what I had today. I'm a little ahead of time, so I'm happy to answer any questions if I can. Yeah. Let's see if I'll take a moment to look at the chat. Yeah, Liz, the time lapse, I have a ton of time lapse videos and real-time videos showing the move. So anybody who would like to see more of that, it was pretty extraordinary to watch being on site. So I'd be happy to share some of that.
Erica Hill's wondering if there's some of the final locations for the church. What are the options?
Yeah, actually, Erica, that's an excellent question. And we have a really great candidate location in mind that the community is in support of. And, so there's an airstrip not far from the church. And so we need to coordinate with DOT and FAA on, getting past the airstrip to this location that's pretty much on the other side of the airstrip between the current airstrip and the current modern community of Karluk. And so we refer to this location as Grandma's Hill. And it's a really great location for a number of reasons. One is it's on a similar kind of promontory, and the church can be oriented similarly and will have a similar view shed, which is important for its this building is obviously listed on the National Register. That's important for it to be able to maintain its National Register listing status. But it's also a great location for a possible new cemetery location for the community to continue to use. So we're hoping that will work out. And we are in communication with DOT and FAA and the Karluk Tribal Council and others, that have ownership or responsibility for that parcel in order to try to figure it out, as well as the state. That's a great question. So everyone keep your fingers crossed that it works out. Oh, that's an excellent question. The question is this church a historical monument only, or is it a current Orthodox parish? It is current. It's still used by the community up until very, very recently, when it became somewhat unsafe to do so. Services and celebrations were still being held in the church up until very, very recently. And so it is used, and we want it to be used, and the community wants to use it. It's a very important place to the community members of Karluk. And so it is an active building, a living building. Yeah, Liz, that's a great comment. I appreciate that. I think so too. And actually there is a filmmaker who is doing a short documentary on this project, Tom Pilifant, and he did a lot of the aerial drone imagery that you will see on Rosia's website and elsewhere. There's an article out about this project in the National Park Service online publication called Park Science, and I can share some of these links in the chat. But it would make an excellent short film for sure. Okay, well, I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm pleased to introduce our colleague who is also working at the site, Esther Babcock, and she helped with doing the GPR inventory at the site.
Hi, Shina, and everyone. My screen says that you've disabled my screen sharing. Shina, can you try that again? Sorry, I should have tried that earlier.
You should be able to now. I've just made you co-host.
Yep.
Okay,
Perfect.
very good. Sorry about that.
Nope, problem solved. Can everyone see my screen?
Looks
Can you
great.
see my screen, Shina?
Yeah,
Yeah.
it looks great.
Okay.
Thank you.
Awesome, yeah. Thanks for the introduction, Shina, and obviously this follows on the heels of your talk quite closely. So a bit of my overview information will be the same, but I'll skim through that and talk about what we did to locate the burials on the site, both prior to the church move and after the church move had occurred. As Shina mentioned, this site is in the village of Karluk on Kodiak Island, so we've had a thorough overview of that. So the scope of work for this particular contribution to the work there in Karluk was to support the church move by locating burials in the vicinity of the church, as the move was originally planned towards the west.
Sorry, Esther, you were accidentally muted. Can you unmute? I'm so sorry about that.
When did I get muted?
Just now, just a second ago.
Okay.
So sorry.
That's okay. That's okay. So as the church was originally planned to move to the west, we wanted to locate the burials in that area so as to hopefully minimize the impact to the cemetery when the church was moved. We used ground penetrating radar in April and October, so before and after the church moved, to fulfill this objective. Sorry. I would like to do a little bit of an overview of the technical details of ground penetrating radar. Hopefully this doesn't bore you all too much, but GPR is a hot topic in the news right now for this type of application for cemeteries in particular and archaeology. And unfortunately, it's easy for people to pick up this tool and not really understand it, which leads to problems in accurately and reliably locating graves. What we're dealing with when we talk about GPR is radar. So we're transmitting an electromagnetic signal into the ground, which travels as a wave and gets reflected from objects in the ground back to the receiver, where it's recorded and then later processed and interpreted. So this reflection part of it is key, and it's due to changes in electrical properties. So we always need to have a contrast in electrical properties between the ground and the object that we're looking for. In the case of burials, this can vary dramatically. So for example, finding a body buried in a coffin is a much different problem than finding a body that was buried in a small box or was natively interred and there's no box or other material around it. And that the contrast also depends on the age of the burial, in the case of bodies that are interred without coffins mainly. Coffins are very easy to detect. So that's new, freshly buried coffins being the easiest grave to detect, all the way to 100-year-old body that's been in the ground and has decomposed and is now just primarily bone. And there's very little contrast between that and the background. So it's really not as simple or as easy as the news networks would lead you to believe. And in fact, extensive research has shown that GPR is successful 80% of the time when used in properly. And we'll talk about what properly means on the next slide. Many people don't use it properly, and then your chance of successful results are dramatically degraded. Even with this statistic, though, it's important to note that GPR is the best available method to locate unmarked graves non-invasively. So there's no other method that compares. This is the best thing we have. It's not perfect, but it does a really good job. And we also use it simultaneously with GPS systems. And I'll show you maps of the interpreted grave locations so that we can record and document those for posterity and have a long-term record that's geo-referenced properly of where the burials are that we've interpreted. So how we implement the GPR, as mentioned, makes a good deal of difference in the chance of successful detection. So we want to always use a relatively high frequency, 250 to 500 megahertz, have a close line spacing. It's easy to fall into the trap of a wider line spacing takes less time and therefore costs less and just takes less time. But if you miss the grave, if you don't cover it enough times, then you have a high probability of not interpreting it properly. So it's really important to have that dense line spacing. And then this pseudo grid data collection and the line orientation. So what we're doing is we're collecting lines that are spaced parallel to each other. That's the pseudo grid I'm talking about. And they're oriented across the graves. So we want to have some sort of information ahead of time that tells us which way the graves are located. And at Karluk, that was pretty easy because there were multiple graves with surface expression, and you can tell they're oriented with their long axis along the long axis of the church. So we were able to plan our lines to run what turns out to be primarily north to south, and I'll show you that on a subsequent slide. Then we can process those data in map view, and I'll show you an example of that as well. Here's a picture of equipment not on the Karluk site. I'll show you the equipment on Karluk in the next slide. This is the typical way that the GPR is employed on this cart. However, in Karluk, we are not dealing with a nice, relatively smooth lawn type cemetery. We're dealing with an older cemetery with a lot of vegetation. This was cut for us on the second visit. which made things a lot easier and more manageable, but the cart really is completely not workable. So we set up this sled system. The church, where this picture is to the west of the church, on the beautiful, beautiful day we had in April to do this work. And you can see these are the antennas in the sled here. The computer is mounted on a chest harness there, as opposed to being on the cart here in this picture. So that's carried by the operator throughout the surveys. And then the global positioning system antenna is mounted above the center point of the GPR antennas so that we can reference the results. The sled is really a two-person job because it's very hard to pull it and keep an eye on the data at the same time. This is a reiteration of what Shina had to say, but here is old imagery of the church location and the cemetery. This picture, sorry, I'm going to come back to that picture. Here's a rough outline of the site taken from the air in October. The weather wasn't quite as good. After the church was moved, you can see the original church location here, and the red is the approximate boundary of where we had surveyed, including April and October, and I'll show an accurate picture of that, not on a slant later on. You can see there are some obstructions to the GPR, such as these trees, which we were told indicate, and it's quite obvious when you're on the site, indicate burials that then a tree was planted over. So this picture is in April, and I just wanted to kind of follow on to what Shina said and just emphasize how dramatic it was, how close this church was to the edge of the bluff. I'm not even, this line might be too far out to really be accurate, but when we landed and made our way over to the church and I walked around because I was curious, I took a literal step back because the bluff was right there. I did not walk around that side of the church again. So it was really quite a precarious situation. This also serves as a picture kind of the system in action, if you will. So you can see pulling it, and then I'm walking along with the antennas, steadying them because of the rough surface, and also looking at the controller so I can monitor the incoming data in real time to make sure we have quality data, and to make sure that I actually am seeing anomalies that I feel will be interpretable later on. As Shina mentioned, logistics is a huge part of work in Karluk. We were thrilled to have support from the village. They offered us a place to stay, so we were able to stay in the school there while we were doing the work, which was excellent. That was in October. In April, we flew in and out on the same day due to COVID concerns. And then we had plenty of support from the village for transportation on the ground, which was obviously essential to getting the job done because there's no way really to operate there without their kind help and support. Here is a picture or a map, very old imagery, apologies for that, but the locations are accurate. So I'll walk you through this. This is where we surveyed in total. The gray is what we completed in April. We went in and out on one trip, one day in April. And so there was a relatively small survey area accomplished, but this was the prioritized area due to the thought that the church would move into the west onto that location. And so the graves in that area were prioritized to be located. In fact, as we know after Shina's talk, the church actually moved more to the south, so it wasn't impacting burials in the area that was originally surveyed. When we went back in October, we surveyed everything that's hatched here and here. This area that's striped was impossible really to cover with the GPR due to surface disturbance where the front of the church had been located, and then the surface terrain features. So even with the sled, there's a limit to what we can pull that sled up and over and still expect to get reliable results. The more movement of the sled back and forth, the rougher the surfaces, the steeper the surfaces, the harder it is to get reliable results. So that area was not able to be surveyed. On the southern portion of the site, there's a path, and the folks at Karluk had told me that there were no burials on the southern side of that path, so we use that as our bounding area for that part of the survey. And then the westernmost part of the survey was bounded by time constraints and the scope of work specifications. it was very interesting to talk to the people on site, and there were indications and local knowledge that there are burials even further to the west out here, and the terrain rises. There's up a little hill, and it's suspected or known that there are, in fact, additional burials even further up that hill. And then I have the trees outlined here because those really aren't able to be covered within the scope of the GPR. And so those are effectively areas where we can't delineate burials with the GPR. However, there's plenty of surface expression of those burials that are under the edges of the trees. So I was able to survey those in with GPS. I'm not a registered land surveyor, but those positions are accurate within plus or minus a foot. There's also likely burials directly in the center of these, underneath the center point of the tree, but it's not possible for me to survey those specifics in. Okay, I have two data examples to show you in profile view. So now we're moving on to the results rather quickly, but this, to calibrate your eyes a bit, this is position along the line, and then this is elevation in feet. So this is what a GPR profile looks like when it's displayed in elevation. And what we're really looking for in this view are anomalies, so things that stand out. So I want to draw your eyes to this region, which is relatively, Shina, you can see my mouse, correct? Hopefully.
Yes, we can see it.
Yes, okay. This region, which is relatively free of reflection events being these colored blue, red, blues you see, and therefore likely not disturbed, potentially something here, but versus this area where there's a lot of disturbance indicating that likely backfill of materials, and then there's high amplitude, meaning bright colors, reflection events below that. So this is, you know, very extremely likely, in my opinion, to be a burial. But this gives you an idea of what we're dealing with. We're not actually seeing bodies, we're not actually seeing coffins, we see data, and we have to interpret that data with respect to what we know about the site and what I or we people doing this have seen previously. So it is an exercise in interpretation to identify the burials. It's not like you see on TV or Jurassic Park. Here's another example. I wanted to draw your attention to this location here, where there were some indications in spots on this site that there were potentially overlapping burials or burials that were extremely close together. Same profile view. What we can do with the pseudo-grid data collection is we take all those profiles here running primarily north-south through the map, and we process them together in specific software designed for this type of data. And then we can look down from above in map view at depth slices. And so we look at one depth slice, then the next, all the way down to the deepest we can see, which was about 7 feet here. And at specific depth slices, we'll see those anomalies come in coherently, which gives us a better idea that those are graves, especially as we can step through the depth slices and see the shape of those appearing in the data. So this is an example of just one depth slice in one small area that shows quite clearly that those anomalies were correlated with grave locations. So in the end, as Shina mentioned, we located over 600 anomalies that were interpreted to be indicative of grave locations. The black here were was the survey area in April, and the red was the survey area in October. And then obviously we have some exclusion area where these trees are, and then where the surface roughness prohibited us from being able to actually image accurately there. A lot of these graves here were newer and visible on the surface, so those were recorded with GPS. And then there was, interestingly, an anomaly that was likely under the original location of the church, but not in an area where we had expected to see something. So in summary, we surveyed about 1.5 acres total at the cemetery and interpreted about 600 likely burial locations. And then, as you saw in the previous slide, we were able to produce georeferenced maps of those anomalies and then transmit those as shape files or KMZ files or whatever you need in order to incorporate that into a long-term GIS database for future use and for record keeping. So this is really the best way to maintain long-term records about where these burials might be. And then, as mentioned, there was some indication that there were additional graves further west of where we had surveyed. And in fact, you see there's really no this was the edge of the survey area. There's really no clear break or gap indicating that we had exited the cemetery. So that's likely to be the case. And it was really terrific to talk with Joyce and other people on site and understand more about what they know about the cemetery and where the burials are and how that had been planned out. But there's also been an article that I was invited to submit to a climate change issue of this magazine that you can look up if you like. And then a huge thank you to the village of Karluk. This work would not have been possible without their help and support, and nor without the help and support of the other entities listed here. Rosia, NPS, Dorothy, Shina, and Grant were immensely helpful throughout the entire process. And so I'm really appreciative of everyone's help and support. With my 2 seconds that I have remaining, I'd just like to point, this is a map of probably not all, but many of the villages in Alaska. So this is a common problem of having burials, but not knowing exactly where they are, either through a lack of markers or just loss of knowledge over time. And I've conducted similar surveys in several other places in Alaska, but there's many places where this technology could be used to help in the face of climate change and erosion, as graves potentially need to be relocated in order to be relocated. And with that, I'll take questions.
Yeah, we have a good time for questions, about 3 minutes or so. First, I want to address Elizabeth's question in the chat, which maybe you and I can both
Sure.
provide a response to. What kinds of measures could be taken if graves are impacted by erosion? So we're not quite sure yet, although we've been in discussions with the community about this, as well as some specialists in grave work with graves and cemeteries. And so what the message we received from the community is that they would like help. If there are graves that are threatened by erosion, they do not want to just naturally let things naturally erode, particularly with respect to the ancestors at the cemetery. And so we will work with the community on coming up with the best strategy for dealing with any graves that are individual graves that are identified as threatened. You know, I don't think that would mean a whole relocation of the entire cemetery, but if there are individual graves that are threatened, you know, and we'll be trying to assess that in the coming seasons, we would work with the community to come up with the best strategy for possible relocation.
Yeah, and I think there's a bit of time too, Shina. None of those graves are located as close as the church was, so it's definitely something that will play out, you know, I don't say slowly, but cautiously over the coming years.
And Esther, here's a question. Thank you for the excellent talk. Are there any graves identifiable from the surface, as in, has the soil subsided?
Yes, there were graves identifiable from the surface through multiple mechanisms. There were fences around a couple graves. There were graves that actually were mounds, very clearly mounded, and then there were graves that were very clearly depressions. And so what was great about that is it was possible for me to run the GPR over those locations and look at the anomalies in the data and say, okay, I know for sure this is a grave. This is in this scenario and at this specific site, this is what a grave looks like in the GPR data. So that is really extremely helpful for calibrating my interpretations, because every site is different. GPR works better in some cases than in others. And there were also headstones in a few, or there were headstones, but there were also markers flush with the ground. I showed a picture of that. That marker was marked 1890 or something. I have to, but so yes.
Yeah, and there are also some traditional cribbing and fencing around some of the graves. So and when I say traditional, I mean in the Russian Orthodox, the practice of Russian Orthodoxy and the burial practices. So thank you so much, Esther. We really appreciate you sharing your expertise and information about the survey that you conducted. And I'm happy to turn this over now to Dr. Rick Knecht. We're switching gears here. Thank you for being here with us, Dr. Knecht. And you should have screen sharing abilities.
Okay, how's that?
It's just about up, I think. Yep, we can see it.
Great. Okay, well, thanks for inviting me to be here. And I want to tell you a little bit about a project. I've got I'm going to try to describe 15 years of work in 15 minutes. So bear with me, but I'll leave some time at the end for questions. We've been working, oops, come on now. Okay. Oh, there we go. This is the location of Quinhagak, and it's in the Yupik culture area, in the kind of the southern edge. And there are about 56 villages in the Yupik region. It's a big, Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta is big. It's roughly the size of Oregon. And, you know, I teach in Scotland. I like to tell them it's the size of Britain, which it is. And yet the prehistory is, especially the late prehistory, is very poorly known. There hasn't been a lot of field work in this area. Let's see. Just about every one of these villages has an earlier village next to it that's got the same, much the same sort of potential, and is also endangered in much the same way as the village of Nunalleq, where we're working. This is Quinhagak. As you can see, it's very low-lying landscape. And as the permafrost supporting this landscape melts, there's subsidence. So you've got, you know, double trouble there with rising sea level. At the same time, the landscape itself is literally sinking. And of course, there's, you know, massive problems with infrastructure and so on because of that. That's widespread. And Quinhagak, like most villages in the Yupik area, very much subsistence based, and they've seen a lot of changes and challenges to their subsistence resource menu. And we've seen some of that, having, you know, worked out there for all these years. We've actually seen some of this in process, where things like, for example, it's so warm right now that they're having trouble drying the salmon, because normally they cover the fish shacks with some fish houses with metal or tarps, but now it's sunny and warm enough where it's creating too much heat, and they're having to turn toward more traditional coverings, sod or something better insulated, because the fish are actually rotting in the heat. Also, there's been a big switch from caribou towards moose, as the caribou herds are retreating and shrinking. It was the snow in the high ground that drove the caribou herds towards the coast where they could be hunted. Now that's kind of disappearing. And they've had a couple whole summer or winters where they didn't have enough snow cover to run snow machines. But the permafrost melting is a big effect on the infrastructure, and of course on the archaeological record. And starting back in 2007, they started seeing big chunks of soil on the beach, and started finding artifacts. And I had worked at Karluk, as it happens, on the big wet site that was washing out there, which turned out to be really good training for what we undertook at Quinhagak. So they sent me pictures of it, and of course I recognized that they were pre-contact wooden artifacts. And they began to hold discussions in the village, and they were pretty reluctant to have an archaeological dig, because the Yupik have a long-standing belief that sites are sacred. They should be allowed to remain undisturbed, and the artifacts stay where they are. And they particularly didn't want to see objects removed from their village. But at the same time, these things are rolling out of the bank, and people were finding things like whole wooden masts and so on. They were selling them to fishermen occasionally. And people were driving their four-wheelers over prehistoric artwork. And the other thing that the elders were worried about is that the younger generation were becoming more and more disconnected from their traditional culture. So the community had two goals. One is to save as many artifacts as they could from the site, and the other is to reconnect their young people to their culture. And it was really that desire to see young people reconnect to their culture that won the day. So after 2 years of discussion, we went out and surveyed the beach following the high tide line. And the first thing we found was a doll. And we were still painted with red ochre. And so we followed that trail of artifacts in the high tide line for about a mile or so and came upon the Nunalleq site. You can see the beams and so on, eroding out very much like the Karluk 1 site when we first saw it in Karluk. And I knew from experience that erosion could take out the whole site, which as we saw in Karluk. So we created a partnership between the University of Aberdeen and the Village Corporation, Knicht. And the Village Corporation provided the logistics, vehicles, places to stay, help with building screens and all the rest of it. A huge amount of help and space inside the village to put up crew. The University of Aberdeen provided the technical expertise. My colleague Charlotte Hillerdahl and Kate Britton. Kate's in charge of sort of the hard science investigations, and Charlotte does the educational outreach and so on, is now involved with a digital museum project for the collection. They'll have 1,000 of the best pieces on display. But the thing that made the whole thing work was the engagement with the community. And so we're able to blend academic and traditional ways of knowing to kind of come at something closer to the truth than before. And the people there weren't the subjects of our study. We weren't there to study Yupik people in Quinhagak. They were our colleagues and our partners. And what really made it fun was sharing that excitement with problem solving and the new finds, and really generated that kind of energy that kept the project going for all this time. So here's the site. As you can see, it's on an actively eroding shoreline. And way in the back, you can see a little tower there. That's the village. I think it's about 4 miles altogether. And so we usually commuted down the beach on four-wheelers, sometimes on a road, and had to walk overland on a high tide. And very much a race against time. Our original excavations from 2009 to 2011 are already overboard, long gone. And the 7,000 pieces we recovered there would have been completely lost. And so we work long hours, six days a week, as much as we can stand, because even now the site could get taken out in one storm. It's been a combination of less ice cover and rising sea levels. And as permafrost melts, that soil has the consistency of bread flour, so it goes very, very quickly. So it was a big project. I had big crews, as many as 30 people in the field at one time. So the logistics of feeding and moving that many people were daunting, but the village stepped in and really made that possible. Most of the people there paid their own travel. They paid for their own food and lodging in the village, which has really helped tremendously. So we relied upon volunteers to help get the project done. As you can see, the preservation is good right from the top. Those are all house posts and so on sticking out of the ground. And we put in a good sized square so we could figure things out, because these houses are big, and we're lucky when we had the preservation, things like boardwalks and so on, to help us figure out what we're looking at. But it turned out to be a very large sod house, quite unusual compared to sod houses we've seen elsewhere, where you get a central room and some adjoining side rooms. This thing was huge. And it had 2 big boardwalks at a right angle that went through it. We still haven't found the end of the boardwalks. A lot of it is eroded out. This may be the only house left on the site. The other thing that was unusual about it was there wasn't any surface indication of it at all. It was only about 10 centimeters higher than the surrounding ground surface. But basically, it was occupied, think about, 1600 AD. And it was during a time of warfare, and we think this house was designed to protect people inside from attack. There's an earlier house underneath it that we think dates back to around the middle of the 1500s. So the preservation was amazing. And because of that, the artifact yield was huge. So dealing with the material coming out of the site was probably the biggest challenge. I mean, and the biggest opportunity, because it told us so much about the past, but there was so much stuff that had to be taken care of. The average digger found 200 pieces a day. And of those, one of them was a jaw-dropping, museum piece. So we had a special tent set aside to process artifacts as they came in. Artifacts had to be kept dry, so we wrapped them in saran wrap and got Tupperware boxes so they wouldn't be crushed, and make sure the Provenus information was recorded. And at the end of the day, we had a big pile of, basketry and artifacts, usually a couple, all those things on the trailer, for example, are a day's finds being taken back. And because we didn't have the facilities to conserve those locally, we had to ship them all back to Aberdeen, Scotland. International shipments of as many as 75 of those black boxes at a time. A real nail biter. I was nervous the whole time they were in flight. But in the end, we didn't lose a thing, or as near as we can tell, we didn't have anything damaged, because the stuff was in good shape, and we we're really careful about packaging it museum style, like a box within a box. As we got deeper, the preservation got better and better. And eventually it was more artifacts and material than it was soil, like digging through kind of a peat moss. And so, when you're digging, you're constantly making decisions about what to save and what to get rid of. And it was really tough going through this material because just about everything was significant in some way. So we took big bulk samples of the soil, big gallon bags. And back in Aberdeen, we've got a great big bank of 10 or so fridges stuffed with these bulk samples. And each one of the gallon bags is like an archaeological dig in miniature. You pick through it with a microscope, and pretty soon you have a little pile of feathers and seeds and leaves and human hair and animal fur, nails of animals, every little thing, little tiny broken bone needles. Just amazing amount of stuff preserved in those floors, as well as the artifacts. But we had to move through it pretty quickly because it was getting eroded so fast. We would have liked just to cut it up in great big meter chunks and taken it apart in the lab, but that just wasn't possible. So we did the best we could. And it's hard to overstate the preservation, but what would turn out to be really valuable is all the bioarchaeological stuff, especially the swatches of human hair that were left on the house floor, where we got information through stable isotope analysis about prehistoric diet. We did the same thing for the dogs. We got DNA on the humans and the dogs, and we studied the insects. Sampled all kinds of stuff. And we learned that labs that do very expensive analysis are willing to do that for free in order to get access to this kind of data. And, and the reason for this is the better preservation is because it had been thawed in less time. In other words, stuff that had been thawed in just a few months, the grass was still green. Everything was there, all the organics and stuff. But in things that have been thawed for a few months or years, you can see the difference in preservation right away. When we expose floors like this, you could see the green grass and the sawdust and the little curls of wood from manufacturing actually turn brown in front of your eyes as the oxygen hit it. Well, we got a lot of grass artifacts that we didn't expect, woven grass mats on the house floors with the artifacts on them, and baskets, and even down in the lower left, lamp holders that originally suspended lamps or even pottery from the ceiling with the woven grass strands of cordage. When we first started digging, the stuff had been thawed out for a year or two at least, and we found relatively few pieces of cordage. As we got into layers that had been thawed more recently, we really hit the grass, and we find maybe 1,000 grass artifacts in a season. And the scary bit is that what we've learned is, as bad as erosion is, thawing is even worse, because all these beautifully preserved sites across the Arctic are literally rotting in the ground. And one of the first things you lose is the grass, and then you lose the leather. We didn't find very much sinew, but we found gut skin, pieces of boots, mittens. Often some of the boots had the original grass liners in them, but they don't stay there forever. And it's terrifying to think of how few of these sites are being rescued. Wood was the main material. We found about 80% of the collection are made of wood, a lot of bent wood, many with the paint still remaining, and objects of all kinds here with little faces on, showing the Inua, or spirit, that lives inside of the artifact. Hunting gear, snow goggles, visors, lots of point sheaths with the original lashing still intact. And with the sinew gone, it still left shadow. So you can see where things, how bow sinew was attached, for example, or how arrows are hafted, and the paint designs on the arrows. In a normal site, without this preservation, all we'd find is that bloody end blade there. So, huge amount of information in these sites. Even the bone and ivory stuff, like the fish lures, still had the little ochre in the dots to attract fish, or little flecks of mica because of that preservation. We found about 400 dolls, some of them still wrapped in the fur clothing that they originally had, and a lot with the paint still on them. We found a lot of little masks that were made for the dolls, for example, and let's see, and full-size masks. These are all full-sized Yupik masks, and a lot of them still had the paint and a lot of mask attachments, for example, still there. So, and the carving tools used to make them. These are rodent teeth embedded in wooden handles. Those little smiles are where a spare tooth could be placed. And the lithics, spectacular stuff, imported nephrite from the North Slope, and still hafted in these little drills. These are ivory earrings with little wooden insets. So what we found out, to make a long story short, is that the house, using studies of artifact distributions and looking at the dietary studies of individuals within the house, we saw that there's a lot of variation in human diet. That, you could figure out what people generally ate from the fallen remains and so on, but it turns out there's a lot of variation between individuals. And some of that was related to status and access to food. And so it was a much less egalitarian household than we expected to find, with librettes located in certain rooms and certain ownership marks that corresponded to better or lesser fed people. There was a room where we suspect that slaves were kept because they're eating the same thing as the dogs. So a tremendous amount of information coming out of that. So at the end of every year, we would show our, the best finds to the community in an event that lasted all day. But the ultimate question was, where is this stuff going to go finally? It's 100,000 pieces that we've collected. It's a huge collection, incredibly significant. But in the end, the village had put just as much work into this as we had, and it just couldn't go. We just didn't have the heart to pack it away to some museum, because we might as well send it to the moon, even at Fairbanks. No one would ever see it again. So they moved a preschool building over and put museum grade furnishings in it. And so the collections are now housed back in Quinhagak. And so now we do the conservation right there. This is the conservation lab. Those are all pieces from one field season. They're treated with polyethylene glycol. Takes about 3 weeks to a month to do an average artifact. We do them in lots depending on their size. The ivory and bone are slow dried in the fridges in the background. And so the expensive bit, which is shipping the artifacts back and forth, is now done locally. So once we have a local lab, and the lab doubles as a workshop during the off season. This is the basketry workshop being sponsored by the Smithsonian, using some of the basketry we brought back as models. So cultural activities take place there. And this is the collections room where the analysis goes on and photography of the artifacts. And it's become a real community center for elders, for young people, and for local research. And what really impressed me was there was a group of young people who had grown up with the project. We started and got permission to start a dance group. And dancing hadn't been allowed in the village for more than 100 years. And when we brought the artifacts back, they celebrated with a song. And just a picture of them writing it on the site, a song that celebrated the return of the pieces in the same way they would celebrate the return of lost relatives. And so that's my story. I'm sticking to it, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you, Dr. Knecht. We are technically on a break until 12:20, so we can take some questions if folks have any. We have time. In the chat, Rick, are you planning another field season this year?
Yes, we are. We had some delays because of COVID and so on, but we're going to go out mostly working on the collections, but we're going to be profiling the site and doing some drone survey. We're still, I think, hopefully in the last year of cataloging the site. I've got a fellowship for 3 years to get the site written up, and we've got teams of specialists working on different artifact classes. If anyone's interested in coming out this summer, just drop me an email.
Any other questions? Folks can jump in.
Okay.
Well, that makes me happy.
Hey, Rick, I have a question.
Okay.
Do you want to talk a little bit about the similarities between a lot of the material culture from late prehistoric or late Russian contact Kodiak sites, especially the kind of stuff you saw at Karluk and a lot of the material culture from Nunalleq?
Yeah, that's been a really interesting thing. The organic material culture, stuff that's plastic, in other words, like wood, stuff you can carve, wood, and some of the basketry, and especially the ideological stuff, masks and the dolls, very, very much like Karluk. And stylistically, a lot of the weaponry, the bows and the darts and stuff, very, very close. You could tell that they're Yupik speakers, super close. But what falls off the wall are the lithics, the lithic assemblage. Yeah, we had M blades, we had Ulu blades, but other than that, you couldn't tell they were the same people. There's whole artifact classes that are really common in Kodiak that were completely missing. Stuff like net sinkers, didn't have any. Not the notched and pebbled net sinkers. Didn't have any cobble scrapers, none of them. And other things that were really, and the lamps, totally different. The lamps here are clay, made of unfired clay, tempered with dog fur. And so if you looked at the lithic assemblage, you would never in a million years think that they were speaking the same language or had the same heritage. And that was an eye opener, because so many ethnic kind of analyses, or so many sequences depend on lithics, solely depend on lithics. But I got to tell you, it didn't work this time. But the organics, dead on. You'd recognize them in a minute. They looked a little earlier. They looked a little Katchmacky, because this is like 1600s. They looked a little earlier. The librettes and stuff looked very common. Again, millions of librettes, but it tended to be more of an earlier style. Same way with their darts. Their sea mammal darts looked, if I saw them on Kodiak, I would think it was earlier than it was. I don't know if, but on the whole, it looked a lot less of a disappear in a K1 collection and vice versa.
Rick, you'll have to check the chat. There's lots of words of praise and encouragement. And so I
Okay.
won't read all of them, but definitely take a look. Everyone is really
Okay.
happy to hear about this update and particularly your work with the communities. So
Great,
this
thanks. I've been afraid to press that button. Not sure what I would do.
that's okay. You can press it now. No
Okay.
harm.
All right.
Everyone, we're going to be on break until about 12:20. Feel free to continue a conversation if you'd like here in this room. And I'm going to just stop recording and then we'll start recording again at 12:20.
Okay, bye now.